Rabbani, who is the co-editor of Jadaliyya, an online magazine specialising on the contemporary Middle East. He joins us from Yerevan in Armenia. Mouin, great to have you on the program. What's your assessment of Israel's reputation and whether the international support has shifted as we head into day 8 of the war and, as we've been reporting, as the number of Palestinian civilians killed continues to grow?
Well, there's a tendency to equate the international community with the West, and I think here we have to make a clear distinction between the two. I think the international community has made its position on this this issue clear for many decades, that there needs to be a just solution, and that a just solution can only be achieved on the basis of Palestinian self-determination. And during the past week, within the international community, we have seen not only fairly widespread condemnations of the attacks conducted by Palestinian organizations on October 7th, but also quite widespread condemnation of Israeli attacks on the Gaza Strip, which are pulverizing an entire territory, calls for mass and ethnic cleansing, explicitly genocidal threats against an entire society, and so on. I think we have to distinguish between the general international response on the one hand and the Western one on the other, which has been to fully embrace the Israeli narrative, which, particularly if you look at the Americans, who are once again being more pro-Israel than Israel itself, the Americans have tried to present what happened on October 7th as somehow representing a combination of the Holocaust, 9/11, and ISIS, something completely unrelated to the local realities and local context and local history, and have fully embraced Israel's actions over the past week. And then if you look at Europe, you had, for example, today, the European Union's senior official going on a solidarity visit to Israel under these present circumstances and basically embracing Israel's agenda and actions uncritically, landing in Tel Aviv on the same day that more than 1 million people were told to flee their homes. And if I may, I do think it's important to point out that this official, Ursula von der Leyen, is a German, because what we've consistently seen in German policy is that, you know, it's almost as if every time a Palestinian child is blown to smithereens, they can somehow feel a little less guilty over their own extermination of Europe's Jews during the 1940s.
We have seen somewhat of a softening, though, if you could call it that, from the leaders in the US. Antony Blinken has hopes, or has said he's trying to ensure stability in the region. We saw somewhat of a softening reported by Paddy Calhoun last night about President Biden as he was speaking in Philadelphia, I believe, calling for somewhat of a restraint. Can we take anything from those comments?
No, not at all. I mean, if you listen to President Biden's speech the other night, it was quite clear. You know, Israel will get whatever it needs. Israel will decide how it deals with this situation. There will be no strings attached on unlimited American assistance to Israel. And is essentially being given a blank check. But I do want to say there's a subtext here, that amid this rush to embrace Israel and its agenda and its pulverization of an entire people and its ethnic cleansing and so on, I think there is also a sudden realization among Israel's Western partners that the Israeli military is not all it's cracked up to be. And if you look, for example, at the dispatch of US aircraft carriers to the Eastern Mediterranean, and now the British are getting involved, there's a sense, you know, that Israel is incapable of defending itself and will need massive international participation if this war broadens. It's unclear to me whether at this point this is something the United States hopes to avoid, or whether, if we take reports that it's trying to renege on its recent prisoner deal with Iran and so on, whether it's something that the U.S. is actually encouraging. But, beneath all the rhetoric, I think there is this realization that Israel functioning, I think, as Ronald Reagan put it many years ago, as a stationary aircraft carrier in the Middle East to serve American interests, is not really a workable assumption anymore.
Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has visited troops in southern Israel near the border fence with the Gaza Strip. So there are reports of a ground invasion potentially being imminent. What impact would that have on what is already a dire situation?
Well, if your question is about the humanitarian impact, we don't need to wait for the ground invasion, because in the past week, we've already seen the absolutely catastrophic, devastating impact of the constant, massive Israeli air attacks on the Gaza Strip, which, by the way, is one of the most intensive bombing campaigns in recent history. We're talking about entire families being wiped out, and one doesn't need to have very much military knowledge to understand that what we are seeing now is a frenzy of revenge being exacted upon an entire population with little, if any, genuine military significance in terms of Israel directly taking on Palestinian militants in the Gaza Strip. That's something that I expect to see more of if and when the ground invasion materializes. But once it does, of course, then we're in a different stage. Then we have to ask questions such as, to what extent Israel is able to achieve its objectives, to what extent others may or may not get involved in this conflict. And even then, I think we will simply see an enormous multiplication of civilian suffering in the Gaza Strip. Because on the one hand, neither the Palestinians nor the neighboring state of Egypt is accepting that somehow this entire problem should be exported to Egypt, and these people, 75% of whom are refugees, should once again become refugees in Egypt. At the same time, Israel, which is demanding that they leave the northern Gaza Strip, then goes bombing fleeing convoys and will, of course, never open its own borders to provide these people refuge. So it's a catastrophe that's going to become absolutely cataclysmic.
That just brings me to my final question, and if I may, Mouin, just briefly, mediation efforts have begun to focus on ceasefire negotiations. Firstly, how worried are governments in the region about their own stability, and what should we be looking out for, or how hopeful can we be that these ceasefire negotiations will be successful?
I don't really accept the premise of your question, because I think one of Secretary of State Blinken's objectives during this visit is to impress upon those in the Arab world who he meets with that there will be no ceasefire, and they should not ask for a ceasefire. A week from now, if the situation is very different, he may come back and beg them to help him achieve a ceasefire.
But I guess more, sorry, sir, I mean more from the regional players' perspective, from the Middle East and regional players.
Well, the Middle Eastern regional players would very much like to see a ceasefire and a cessation of hostilities, many of them for different reasons. But I think Blinken is there to tell them, we're going to do this because, of course, now there's a total identification between Washington and Tel Aviv, and to tell them your calls for a cessation of hostilities are going to be ignored. That's been the general pattern. And then when things get out of hand from Israel and Washington's perspective, they come back and ask for help in achieving a ceasefire.
Well, respectfully, I hope you're wrong. Thank you very much, Mouin Rabbani.
I hope I am too.
Yes, I think we all hope you're wrong. Mouin Rabbani, the co-editor of Jadaliyya online magazine specialising on contemporary Middle East. Thank you so much.
Thank you.